The worst kind of heartbreak isn't the one that breaks your heart. It's the one that makes you question whether you were ever loved at all. Rain tapped softly against the stained glass windows of St. Michael's Chapel, turning the colored light into blurred streaks across the empty pews. Just an hour earlier, the room had been filled with music, flowers, whispered excitement, and the promise of a future. Now it felt abandoned, silent, hollow. Juliet Parker sat alone in the front row, her wedding dress pooling around her feet like something she no longer recognized. The white roses lining the aisle had already begun to droop beneath the humid summer air. Guests were gone. Family members had stopped calling her name. Even the wedding coordinator had quietly disappeared after offering one last apology she couldn't fix. The groom never came. That was the truth nobody wanted to say out loud. Ethan hadn't been delayed. He hadn't been injured. He hadn't changed his mind at the last second in some dramatic movie scene. He had simply left the chapel, left the city, left her standing at the altar with hundreds of eyes watching her world collapse. Juliet stared at the wedding ring resting in her palm. It felt heavier than gold should. 3 days ago, she had almost cancelled everything after finding messages on Ethan's phone, messages that didn't belong between an engaged man and another woman. But her father had convinced her to continue. He had insisted it was stress, a misunderstanding, cold feet. Looking back now, she wondered if he had known more than he admitted. A shaky breath escaped her as tears slid down her cheeks. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere over Long Island Sound inside. Only silence answered her. Then she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate. Not the hurried pace of staff cleaning up after disaster. Not the cautious steps of family members checking on her. These sounded different, confident, controlled. Juliet wiped her eyes and looked toward the back of the chapel. A tall man stood near the entrance. Rain darkened the shoulders of his charcoal overcoat. He looked completely out of place among the wedding decorations. Dark hair, broad shoulders, calm posture. The kind of presence that changed the atmosphere of a room without effort. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Colored light shifted across his face as he walked down the aisle. Every step echoed softly against the wooden floor. Juliet immediately recognized him. Not personally, she had seen photographs, newspaper articles, business magazines. Sebastian Romano, one of the most powerful real estate developers in New York. A man whose name appeared beside billion-dollar projects and charity foundations. Yet none of that explained why he was standing inside her ruined wedding. He stopped several feet away, close enough for conversation, far enough to respect the distance she desperately needed. His eyes settled on the ring in her hand, then on her face. There was no pity there. Somehow that made it worse, or maybe better. Juliet couldn't decide. "You should go," she said quietly. Her voice sounded smaller than she intended. Sebastian remained still. "I don't think you want to be alone right now." Juliet almost laughed. The sound came out broken instead. "I think everyone has already made that decision for me." The rain intensified against the windows. For several seconds he said nothing. Then his gaze shifted toward the altar before returning to her. "Juliet Parker." She froze. He knew her name. A chill moved through her chest. They had never met. She was certain of it. "How do you know who I am?" she asked. Sebastian's expression remained unreadable. Outside, lightning briefly illuminated the stained glass behind him. For an instant he looked less like a businessman and more like a man carrying secrets he wasn't ready to share. Then he answered with a sentence that made the air feel suddenly colder. "Because I came here for someone else." Some promises sound comforting. Others sound like warnings. Juliet stared at Sebastian Romano as the last trace of thunder rolled beyond the chapel walls. His answer lingered in the air between them. "Because I came here for someone else." The words settled heavily inside her chest. For a moment she forgot about the ruined wedding, the empty pews, and the ring still resting in her palm. All she could focus on was the strange certainty in his voice. He had not sounded surprised to find her here. He sounded disappointed that someone else was missing. "What does that mean?" Juliet asked. Sebastian glanced toward the altar before returning his attention to her. The stained glass painted fragments of blue and gold across the floor. "It means today did not unfold the way I expected." Juliet let out a quiet breath. "That makes two of us." The corner of his mouth almost moved, not quite a smile, not quite sadness, something in between. Outside, rain continued to slide down the chapel windows in long silver lines. The storm had driven everyone away hours ago, yet Sebastian remained. Juliet could not understand why. Men like him did not spend Friday evenings standing in nearly empty churches. They certainly did not spend them talking to abandoned brides. "If you are looking for Ethan, you are too late," she said. "Apparently everyone is." Sebastian's expression changed so slightly most people would have missed it. Juliet did not. Something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition, confirmation, as though Ethan's name connected to a puzzle piece he already possessed. "I am not looking for Ethan," he said. "Then why are you here?" For several seconds he did not answer. The silence stretched. Somewhere near the entrance, an old wooden beam creaked softly. Finally, Sebastian reached into the pocket of his coat and removed a folded handkerchief. White linen, simple, expensive. He offered it without stepping closer. Juliet hesitated before taking it. "Thank you. You should not thank me for basic decency." The statement surprised her. Most wealthy men she had encountered during wedding performances carried themselves like the world owed them attention. Sebastian sounded almost annoyed by the idea of praise. Juliet wiped her eyes and looked away. The embarrassment of crying in front of a stranger returned all at once. A powerful stranger, a dangerous stranger. If half the rumors about him were true. What she did not know was that less than a mile away, inside a dark office overlooking the harbor, a phone had already begun ringing with news about Ethan's disappearance, and unfortunately for her, that news would soon matter more than she could imagine. Back inside the chapel, Juliet rose slowly from the pew. Her legs felt unsteady after hours of emotional exhaustion. "I should go home." Sebastian nodded. "Probably." Yet neither moved toward the door. The silence returned, not awkward, just heavy, as if both were waiting for something neither understood. Then Juliet's phone vibrated. Jump, she looked at the screen. Her father's name appeared across the display. For a second she considered ignoring it. Then she answered, "Dad?" The voice on the other end sounded strained, too strained. "Juliet, where are you?" She frowned. Relief flooded through the speaker. Relief, not concern. Relief. "Good. Stay there. I am coming." Before she could ask why, the call ended. Juliet lowered the phone slowly. Sebastian had noticed the change in her expression. "Something wrong?" She shook her head. "I am not sure." His gaze remained fixed on her for another second. Then he spoke words that sent an unexpected chill through her. "Juliet, when your father gets here, listen carefully to what he says." "Why?" The rain hammered harder against the stained glass. Sebastian looked toward the chapel entrance. "Because tonight," he said quietly, "someone is going to tell you a lie." The most dangerous lies are not the ones strangers tell. They are the ones spoken by people whose voices have comforted you your entire life. Juliet stared at Sebastian as his warning settled over the chapel like another layer of storm clouds. Before she could ask what he meant, headlights swept briefly across the stained glass windows. A car had pulled into the parking lot. Sebastian looked toward the entrance but said nothing. The heavy wooden doors opened less than a minute later. Richard Parker stepped inside, slightly out of breath, his dress shirt wrinkled beneath an expensive raincoat. Relief immediately crossed his face when he saw Juliet standing near the front pews. "Thank God," he said as he hurried forward. "I have been trying to reach you." Juliet frowned. "You just called me 20 minutes ago." Her father paused, only for a second, but she noticed it. "Right, yes, of course," he forced a smile. "It has been a difficult day." His eyes shifted towards Sebastian. The smile disappeared instantly. Something colder replaced it, something careful Romano. Sebastian gave a small nod. "Mr. Parker." The exchange lasted only a moment, yet the tension was impossible to miss. Juliet looked from one man to the other. "You know each other?" Her father answered too quickly. "Not really." Sebastian remained silent. That silence bothered her more than any argument could have. Richard turned back to her. "Juliet, we should leave." "Leave? Come home. We will figure everything out tomorrow." Tomorrow. Everyone kept pushing answers into tomorrow. Ethan had done it. Her father had done it. Even relatives earlier in the day had promised tomorrow would make sense of everything. Juliet suddenly felt exhausted by the word. "What happened today, Dad?" she asked quietly. Richard's jaw tightened. "Your fiancé made a selfish decision. That is all." Sebastian looked away toward the rain-covered windows. Juliet noticed. It was subtle, almost invisible. Yet it felt deliberate, like a man choosing not to interrupt someone making a mistake. "That is not what I asked," she said. Her father exhaled heavily. "Juliet, please." The chapel fell silent again. Rain tapped softly against the glass. Somewhere outside, wind rattled tree branches. Then Richard stepped closer and lowered his voice. "There are things happening that you do not understand." Juliet blinked, then explained them. "I cannot." Another pause, another hesitation, another answer that felt incomplete. Her chest tightened. The same feeling she had experienced 3 days earlier when she found suspicious messages on Ethan's phone. The same feeling that had followed her all morning. the feeling that everyone around her knew something she did not. What Juliet could not see was the way Sebastian's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Nor could she know that earlier that week, Richard Parker's name had appeared inside a financial report sitting on a conference table 30 stories above Manhattan. A report Sebastian had personally reviewed. Back in the chapel, Richard gently touched her shoulder. "Come home." Juliet looked down. The wedding ring still rested in her hand. Then she looked up again. "Did Ethan leave because he wanted to?" Her father's eyes widened slightly. "Of course he did. And you are telling me the truth?" For the first time, Richard did not answer immediately. The hesitation lasted less than 2 seconds, yet it felt longer, long enough. Juliet slowly turned toward Sebastian. He said nothing. He did not confirm her fears. He did not deny them. He simply held her gaze, and somehow that silence spoke louder than words. Then her father reached into his coat pocket and accidentally dropped something onto the polished chapel floor. A folded document slid across the wood. Richard reacted instantly, bending to retrieve it, but not before Juliet caught sight of a familiar name printed near the top of the page. Romano Holdings. Her heart skipped. Richard quickly folded the paper away, too quickly. "What was that?" she asked. "Nothing important." Sebastian's eyes never left the document. Richard grabbed Juliet's arm gently and guided her toward the aisle. "We are leaving." Juliet allowed herself to take a few steps. Then she stopped. Because for the first time all day, one fact suddenly felt impossible to ignore. Somehow her father possessed documents connected to Sebastian Romano, and somehow neither man seemed surprised by that reality. As thunder rolled across the dark New York sky, Juliet realized the wedding might not be the biggest secret waiting to unravel. Sometimes a single piece of paper can change the meaning of an entire day. The drive home felt longer than it should have. Rain followed Juliet's father's sedan through the dark roads of Westchester County, turning every streetlight into a blurred ribbon of gold across the windshield. Richard Parker barely spoke. His hands remained locked on the steering wheel. The radio stayed off. The silence inside the car felt deliberate. Juliet sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window while questions piled higher with every passing mile. Romano Holdings, the name refused to leave her mind. She had seen it clearly on the document before her father hid it away. Every instinct told her that paper mattered. Every instinct told her Sebastian's warning inside the chapel had not been random. By the time they reached home, the rain had softened into a cold mist drifting across the front lawn. Their house stood at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, its porch light glowing softly against the darkness. It had always looked safe to Juliet, familiar. Tonight it looked different, smaller somehow. Like a stage set she had lived inside without noticing the painted walls. Richard unlocked the front door and stepped inside. "You should get some sleep," he said immediately. "We can talk tomorrow." Juliet closed the door behind her. "You have been saying that all day." Her father loosened his tie and walked toward the kitchen. "Because today has been difficult, then stop treating me like a child." He stopped moving. For a moment she thought he might finally answer honestly. Instead, he opened the refrigerator and reached for a bottle of water. "Nothing is going on." The lie landed harder this time because she was expecting it. Juliet watched him carefully, the hesitation before every answer, the avoidance. The way he refused to look directly at her whenever Sebastian's name appeared. It all felt wrong. "How do you know Sebastian Romano?" she asked. The bottle nearly slipped from Richard's hand, only slightly. "But enough. I do not." "Then why did you have documents with his company's name on them?" Silence. Richard took a slow drink before setting the bottle on the counter. "Business paperwork. You told me you retired from consulting 2 years ago." "I did." "Then why are you carrying business paperwork?" The kitchen lights reflected against the polished granite countertop. Somewhere upstairs an old air vent rattled softly. Richard looked exhausted, older than he had that morning, but none of that answered her question. "There are financial matters that would only confuse you." Her chest tightened. "Try me." Again he chose silence. Unfortunately for Juliet, less than 30 miles away, Sebastian Romano was sitting inside a glass-walled conference room overlooking Manhattan. A thick folder rested open on the table before him. Richard Parker's name appeared repeatedly throughout the pages. Beside it sat another name, Ethan Caldwell. Sebastian stared at both names for several seconds before closing the folder. The timing was becoming impossible to ignore. Back in the Parker home, Juliet climbed the stairs feeling more unsettled than before. Her wedding dress still hung heavily from her shoulders. She entered her bedroom and quietly closed the door. For a long moment she simply stood there. Then she began removing jewelry and placing it on her dresser one piece at a time. Earrings, bracelet, necklace. Finally, the wedding ring. The room felt painfully quiet. She opened the top drawer to put everything away. That was when she noticed an envelope tucked beneath a stack of sheet music. Her name was written across the front in Ethan's handwriting. Juliet froze. She had never seen it before. Her pulse quickened. Slowly she picked up the envelope. The paper felt freshly placed, recent, deliberate. Outside, the wind brushed softly against her bedroom window. Downstairs, her father moved through the house, pretending everything was normal. But standing alone beneath the dim bedside lamp, holding a letter she had never received, Juliet realized someone had hidden the truth from her long before the wedding ever fell apart. Some truths arrive quietly, not with shouting, not with drama. Just a single piece of paper waiting in the dark. Juliet sat on the edge of her bed staring at the envelope while rain traced slow paths down the window beside her. Ethan's handwriting was unmistakable. She had seen it on birthday cards, grocery lists, and the dozens of notes he used to leave beside her piano before everything changed. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened the seal. The letter inside contained only a single page, no greeting, no explanation for disappearing, no apology, at least not at first. She unfolded it carefully and began reading. "Juliet, if you are reading this, then things happened the way I feared they would." The words immediately tightened something inside her chest. She continued, "There are things I should have told you weeks ago. I wanted to. More than once. Every time I tried, someone convinced me to wait. Someone convinced me it would all work out. It never did." Juliet lowered the page for a moment. Someone. The word felt intentional. Ethan could have written a name. Instead, he had chosen ambiguity. She kept reading. "You deserve the truth, but I am not the person who can safely explain it. If you want answers, do not look at me. Look at the people who kept pushing this wedding forward even when they knew it should not happen." Her pulse quickened. The room suddenly felt smaller. She reached the bottom of the page. There was no signature, only one final sentence. "Trust your instincts. They have been warning you longer than you realize." Juliet stared at the letter for several seconds, then several more. She read it again, slowly. This time every word felt heavier. The wedding, her father's insistence, Ethan's strange behavior over the past month, the hidden document in the chapel, Sebastian's warning. The pieces were beginning to touch each other, but not enough to form a picture. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. The sound made her quickly fold the letter. "Juliet?" Her father's voice came through the door. "Are you all right?" She slid the paper beneath a music book before answering. A pause followed. "Can I come in?" Normally she would have said yes immediately. Tonight she hesitated. "I am tired." Another silence. "Get some rest." His footsteps eventually retreated down the hallway. Juliet waited until she could no longer hear them. Then she stood and crossed the room. Her gaze settled on the old upright piano near the far wall. Music had always been her refuge, ever since childhood. Ever since her mother passed away, the piano gave her somewhere to hide. She sat down on the bench and gently pressed a few keys. Soft notes drifted through the room, fragile, lonely, familiar. For nearly 20 minutes she played quietly while the storm faded outside. The music helped slow her breathing, helped organize thoughts that felt impossible to untangle. Then her phone vibrated. The sudden sound broke the stillness. Juliet looked down. An unknown number appeared on the screen. Normally she would have curiosity won. "Hello?" For several seconds only silence answered, then a man's voice spoke. Calm, controlled, familiar. "You found the letter." Juliet froze. Her fingers tightened around the phone. She immediately recognized the voice. Sebastian Romano. "How do you know about that?" she asked. The line remained quiet for a moment, not because he was searching for words, because he seemed to be choosing them carefully. "Because," he said at last, "the person who left it was supposed to meet me 3 days ago." Juliet's heartbeat stumbled. She rose slowly from the piano bench. "Ethan?" Another pause, longer this time. Then came an answer that changed everything she thought she knew about the man who abandoned her. "Juliet," Sebastian said quietly, "Ethan did not disappear because he wanted to leave you. The truth rarely arrives all at once. More often, it enters through a crack and slowly tears the entire wall apart." Juliet stood beside the piano with the phone pressed tightly against her ear. For several seconds she forgot how to breathe. "Ethan did not disappear because he wanted to leave you." The sentence echoed through the quiet bedroom. Outside, the storm had finally begun to fade, leaving only the occasional drip of rainwater from the roof. "What does that mean?" she asked. Sebastian's voice remained calm. "It means the story you were given is incomplete." Juliet moved toward the window. The glass felt cool beneath her fingertips. "Then tell me the complete story." Silence answered first, not because he was refusing, because he seemed to be measuring every word. I cannot do that tonight. Frustration surged through her. Everyone keeps saying that, because some truths become dangerous when they arrive in the wrong order. She closed her eyes. That sounds like another excuse. To her surprise, Sebastian did not argue. Maybe it does. The honesty caught her off guard. Downstairs she heard a cabinet door close. Her father was still awake, still moving through the house as though everything remained normal. The sound only sharpened her unease. "Did my father know Ethan was leaving?" she asked quietly. Another pause. "I think your father knew the wedding was built on information you never received." Juliet felt her stomach tighten. It was not an answer, but it was close enough to one. "You are speaking in circles." "Because I am trying very hard not to make assumptions before I have proof." She looked down at the folded letter resting on the piano. Ethan's final message suddenly felt less like a goodbye and more like a warning. "Then why contact me at all?" she asked. "Because after what happened today, who answers the phone when you have questions?" The words landed unexpectedly hard. Juliet stared into the darkness beyond the window. No dramatic promises, no grand speeches. Just a simple statement. Yet it felt more comforting than anything she had heard all day. Unfortunately for Juliet, less than 24 hours earlier, a financial transfer connected to an account she had never heard of had quietly appeared inside an investigation already underway. Her name was nowhere on the documents. Her father's name was, Ethan's name was, and that coincidence was becoming increasingly difficult for investigators to ignore. "What was Ethan supposed to meet you about?" she finally asked. This time Sebastian answered immediately. "You." Juliet frowned. "Me? Not personally." His voice softened slightly. "Your future." She turned away from the window. "That makes no sense." "It will." The grandfather clock downstairs chimed midnight. 12 slow notes drifted through the house. Juliet suddenly realized how exhausted she felt. The wedding, the chapel, the letter, the phone call. It all seemed unreal. "What happens now?" she asked. For the first time since the conversation began, Sebastian sounded absolutely certain. "Tomorrow morning, do not sign anything your father puts in front of you." Her heartbeat quickened. Why would he ask me to sign something? I do not know if he will. Another careful answer, but if he does, read every word. Juliet stared toward her bedroom door. A strange feeling settled over her. Not fear, not exactly. Instinct. The same instinct Ethan mentioned in his letter. The same instinct that had been whispering to her for weeks. Then a floorboard creaked in the hallway outside her room. Someone was standing there. Juliet slowly turned toward the door. The shadow beneath it shifted. Her father had stopped walking, had stopped moving entirely, as though he had been listening. And before she could say another word, the bedroom doorknob began to turn. Some moments divide a life into before and after. Juliet stared at the slowly turning doorknob while her pulse hammered in her ears. The phone remained pressed against her cheek. For a fraction of a second nobody spoke. Then Sebastian's voice came through the line. Calm, focused. "Juliet?" She swallowed. "Someone is outside my room." The doorknob stopped moving. Silence settled over the hallway. Silence settled inside the bedroom. Then came her father's voice through the door. "Are you still awake?" Richard sounded normal. Too normal. Juliet looked toward the entrance. "Yes." Another pause followed. "Can I come in?" She glanced at the phone. Sebastian said nothing. He did not tell her what to do. He simply waited. The decision remained hers. Juliet slowly unlocked the door. Richard stepped inside, carrying a manila folder tucked beneath one arm. He smiled when he saw her. The expression looked familiar. The same smile he used when she was 10 years old and nervous before piano recitals. The same smile he wore when convincing her everything would be all right. Yet tonight something felt different. The folder immediately caught her attention. Sebastian's warning echoed through her mind. "Tomorrow morning, do not sign anything your father puts in front of you." Except it was not tomorrow morning anymore. It was already after midnight. Richard noticed the phone. "Who are you talking to?" Juliet hesitated. "A friend." The answer was technically true, at least more true than anything she had heard recently. Her father's eyes narrowed slightly. "At this hour? It has been a strange day." Richard nodded slowly. Then he placed the folder on her dresser. "I actually came because there is something I need from you." Juliet's stomach tightened. Sebastian remained silent on the line, listening, waiting. Richard carefully opened the folder and removed several documents, legal papers, financial forms, signatures marked by yellow tabs. "What is this?" Juliet asked. Her father sat in the chair beside the window. For the first time all evening he looked genuinely tired. "Protection. Protection from what?" Richard rubbed his forehead. "The fallout from today." Juliet approached the dresser. She did not touch the papers. What kind of fallout? Her father looked away. The movement lasted only a second, but she noticed it. She noticed everything now. The wedding created complications. For who? Richard sighed heavily. Juliet, please trust me. There it was again. Trust. The word people always used when they wanted obedience instead of questions. She looked down at the documents. Most appeared routine at first glance. Then she saw a company name, Caldwell Development Partners. Ethan's company. Her heartbeat accelerated. Why would I be signing paperwork connected to Ethan? Richard stood immediately, too quickly. Because it is complicated. Then explain it. I cannot explain everything tonight. The answer landed like a stone. Juliet took a slow breath. For weeks she had doubted her instincts. For months she had convinced herself every uncomfortable feeling was anxiety. Every inconsistency was coincidence. Not anymore, Dad, she said quietly. Did you know this wedding was connected to business deals? The room froze. Richard's expression changed, not dramatically, just enough. Enough for her to finally see what she had been missing, the fear. He was afraid. Not angry, not defensive. Afraid. Unfortunately for Juliet, less than an hour earlier, investigators reviewing financial records had reached the same conclusion Sebastian already suspected. The wedding had never been just a wedding. It had been a deadline. A transaction disguised as a celebration. Back in the bedroom, Richard slowly sat down again. The confidence he carried all evening seemed to disappear. Juliet, he said softly, there are things I did because I believed I was protecting our family. Her chest tightened. Protecting us from what? Richard looked toward the folder, then toward his daughter, and when he finally answered, his voice barely rose above a whisper. From losing everything. The hardest betrayals are not the ones that come from enemies. They come from the people who spent years convincing you they were protecting you. Juliet stared at her father as his final words settled into the room. Protecting the family. Losing everything. The phrases sounded important, yet somehow they still failed to explain why her wedding had collapsed, why Ethan had vanished, and why Sebastian Romano seemed connected to every answer she could not reach. The bedside lamp cast a soft amber glow across the documents scattered on the dresser. Shadows stretched across the walls. Outside, the storm had finally passed, leaving the neighborhood wrapped in an uneasy silence. What does that mean? Juliet asked. Richard looked older than she had ever seen him. His shoulders sagged. The confidence he carried in public was gone. Several years ago, he said quietly, I made business decisions that did not work out the way I expected. Juliet folded her arms. Business decisions do not usually destroy weddings. He looked away. You are right. The admission surprised her. For the first time all evening, he was not dodging the question. He was not pretending everything was normal, yet something still felt incomplete. How much money are we talking about? She asked. Richard hesitated. Enough. The answer immediately reignited her frustration. That is not a number, because the number is not the point. Then what is? Richard stood and slowly crossed the room. Moonlight filtered through the window behind him, outlining his silhouette against the glass. The point is that people were depending on certain agreements being completed. Juliet's stomach tightened. What agreements? Again, he hesitated. The silence itself felt like an answer. Dad. Richard closed his eyes briefly. The marriage would have helped stabilize several ongoing financial obligations. Juliet felt the air leave her lungs. For a moment she thought she had misunderstood. Are you telling me my wedding was part of a financial arrangement? Not exactly. Then explain exactly. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw genuine regret. The marriage created trust between parties who needed certainty. Juliet stared at him. Every word sounded carefully chosen. Every word sounded rehearsed. And every word made her feel less like a daughter and more like a contract. The realization hurt far more than Ethan's disappearance. Unfortunately for Juliet, less than 10 miles away, Sebastian sat alone inside his penthouse office, overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The city lights reflected against the floor-to-ceiling windows. A file remained open on his desk. Multiple financial entities appeared throughout the report. Hidden partnerships, delayed transfers, restructured obligations, and buried among them was a simple conclusion that investigators had finally confirmed earlier that evening. Juliet Parker's name appeared nowhere in the scheme. Not once. She had never been involved. She had never benefited. She had simply been positioned at the center without her knowledge. Back in her bedroom, Juliet slowly sat on the edge of the bed. Her hands felt cold. Did Ethan know? She asked. Richard did not answer immediately. That alone told her enough. He knew, she whispered. Her father lowered his head. A painful silence followed. The clock on the nightstand ticked steadily forward. Each second seemed louder than the last, and he tried to tell me. Richard looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Juliet reached beneath the music book and pulled out the letter. The color immediately drained from her father's face. She noticed every detail, every reaction, every flicker of fear. "You knew about this letter," she said softly. Richard took a step toward her. "Juliet, listen to me." But she was already looking at him differently, not as the father who raised her, not as the man who taught her how to ride a bicycle or drove her to piano lessons. Tonight she was looking at a stranger standing in familiar skin. Then her phone vibrated again. One new message appeared on the screen. "Unknown sender, only 7 words. Do not sign anything. Meet me tomorrow." Beneath the message was a location. Romano Holdings. Trust is a fragile thing. Once it cracks, every memory begins to sound different. Juliet barely slept. The message remained glowing in her mind long after she turned off the lamp. Romano Holdings. The words followed her through a restless night filled with half-formed questions and unfinished answers. By morning, pale sunlight spilled across her bedroom floor. The storm was gone. The world outside looked calm. Inside the house, nothing felt calm anymore. She dressed quietly and tucked Ethan's letter into her purse. Downstairs, the smell of coffee drifted through the kitchen. Richard Parker sat at the table already dressed for the day. A folder rested beside his coffee mug. The sight immediately tightened her chest. He looked up when she entered. "Morning." The word sounded almost normal. Almost. Juliet poured herself coffee but remained standing. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Richard slid the folder across the table. "I need you to review something." Every instinct inside her immediately woke up. She glanced at the folder but did not touch it. "What is it?" Routine too quickly. Juliet almost laughed. 24 hours earlier she might have believed him. Not anymore. "I am not signing anything." Richard's expression darkened. "You have not even looked at it, and yet somehow I already know the answer." Silence settled between them. Through the kitchen window she could see sunlight reflecting off wet grass. A beautiful morning, a terrible conversation. Richard leaned back in his chair. For the first time she noticed how tired he looked. "You think I am the villain. I think you are hiding things from me." The distinction mattered, at least to her. Richard looked away. Sometimes protecting someone means carrying burdens they do not understand. Juliet reached into her purse and removed table between them. Her father's face immediately tightened. "He tried to tell me the truth," she said softly. Richard stared at the paper but did not touch it. "No," he replied quietly. He only understood part of it. The answer surprised her, not because it sounded dishonest, because it sounded sincere. Before she could respond, her phone vibrated. One new message, the same unknown number. "The meeting is at 10. Come alone." Juliet looked at the clock above the stove, 9:15. Her pulse quickened. She slipped the phone back into her purse. Richard noticed. "Who keeps contacting you?" She met his gaze. "Someone who actually answers questions." The words landed harder than she intended. Hurt flashed across his face before disappearing. Unfortunately for Juliet, 3 miles away from Romano Holdings, another meeting was already underway. Attorneys, accountants, and investigators sat around a polished conference table, reviewing documents tied to a financial structure that had quietly unraveled. Every new page strengthened the same conclusion. Juliet Parker had never been a participant. She had been leverage. A fact that increasingly disturbed even the people investigating the case. At 9:45, Juliet left the house. Her father did not try to stop her. That almost worried her more. The drive south toward Manhattan felt surreal. Traffic moved steadily beneath clear skies. Radio hosts discussed sports scores and weather forecasts as though the world remained simple. By the time she reached Romano Holdings, the glass tower rose above the city like a mirror reflecting the morning sun. Valets moved efficiently near the entrance. Executives crossed the plaza carrying briefcases and coffee cups. Everything looked polished, controlled, intentional, nothing like the chaos consuming her life. A receptionist escorted her to a private elevator. The ride upward was silent. Floor numbers climbed steadily, 23, 29, 41. The doors finally opened onto a quiet executive floor wrapped in glass and sunlight. And there, standing beside a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking Manhattan, was Sebastian Romano. He turned as she entered. His expression remained calm, but something in his eyes softened when he saw her. Not pity, not sympathy, recognition. As though he understood exactly how much courage it had taken for her to walk through that door. Then he placed a thin file on the conference table and spoke the words that changed everything. "Juliet, I can finally prove that none of this was your fault." The moment people stop blaming themselves is often the moment they finally begin to see who was truly responsible. Juliet stood motionless beside the conference table while sunlight poured through the glass walls surrounding Sebastian's office. Manhattan stretched endlessly below them. Yellow taxis moved like tiny pieces on a board. Ferries crossed the Hudson. Somewhere beneath that peaceful skyline, her entire life was being rearranged. Sebastian opened the file and slid several documents toward her. "Take your time," he said. Juliet lowered herself into a chair and began reading. At first, the pages looked ordinary. Corporate filings, partnership agreements, financial disclosures, then patterns emerged. The same names appeared repeatedly. Ethan Caldwell, Richard Parker, several business entities she had never heard of. What did not appear anywhere was her own name. Not once. Not in a contract, not in a transfer, not in an ownership structure. Nothing. Her hands tightened around the pages. "I do not understand." Sebastian remained standing near the window. "That is because you were never supposed to be involved." Juliet looked up. "Then why am I in the middle of this?" For a moment he seemed to search for the right words. "Because your wedding solved a problem for other people." The statement hit harder than she expected. She stared back down at the documents. Every sacrifice she had made, every compromise, every uncomfortable feeling she had ignored. Suddenly they looked different. "The marriage was never about me." "Not to everyone," Sebastian replied quietly. Silence settled across the room. The city hummed beyond the glass. Juliet continued reading. A timeline sat near the back of the file. Dates, transactions, meetings, delays. Then she found something that made her stop breathing for a second. 3 weeks before the wedding, Ethan had requested a postponement. Her eyes moved across the page again. Then a second request appeared. Then a third. All denied. Juliet slowly looked up. He tried to stop it. Sebastian nodded once, more than once. The room seemed to tilt. For days she had imagined Ethan abandoning her, running away, choosing someone else, choosing anything except her. Now an entirely different picture was forming, not perfect, but different. "Why did nobody tell me?" she whispered. Sebastian's expression darkened slightly, because the truth would have created questions nobody wanted to answer. Juliet leaned back in her chair. Emotion rose unexpectedly in her chest. Not heartbreak this time. Anger. Not at Ethan, not even at herself. Anger at being treated like a piece on someone else's board. Unfortunately for Juliet, there was still one document she had not seen. One document investigators discovered only hours earlier. A document carrying her father's signature beside a clause that mentioned her future marriage as a condition for financial restructuring. Back inside the office, Sebastian finally left the window and sat across from her. For the first time since they met, neither status nor reputation seemed to matter. They were simply two people sitting at opposite sides of a table covered in uncomfortable truths. "There is something else," he said. Juliet immediately felt her stomach tighten. "Of course there is." A faint shadow of sympathy crossed his face. "Your father was not the only person making decisions." Sebastian slid a single page toward her. She looked down. Several signatures occupied the bottom. Investors, partners, advisors. Then she reached the final name. Her breath caught. Ethan Caldwell. The room fell silent. Juliet stared at the signature for several seconds, long enough for disappointment to return, long enough for reality to become complicated again. Ethan had tried to stop it, yet at some point he had still participated, still signed, still moved forward. Nothing was simple anymore, nothing was clean. Sebastian watched her carefully but did not interrupt. He allowed her space to process the contradiction. Finally, Juliet lowered the page. "So everyone lied." Sebastian held her gaze. "Not everyone." Before she could respond, the conference room door opened. A woman in a dark business suit stepped inside carrying a tablet. Her expression was professional, controlled. Yet something about her urgency immediately raised concern. She looked directly at Sebastian. "We found him." Juliet's heart stopped. And for the first time since the wedding day, Ethan Caldwell was no longer missing. The truth does not always arrive with relief. Sometimes it arrives carrying the weight of everything you wished had never happened. Juliet remained seated as the conference room door closed behind the woman. For several seconds, nobody moved, nobody spoke. The city shimmered beyond the glass walls while her heart pounded against her ribs. They found him after days of questions, after sleepless nights, after discovering that nearly every assumption she had made was wrong. Ethan was no longer missing. Sebastian stood slowly. "Where?" The woman placed the tablet on the table. "Connecticut. He contacted an attorney this morning." Juliet immediately noticed something important. Nobody sounded alarmed. Nobody sounded afraid. They sounded relieved. "Is he all right?" she asked before she could stop herself. The woman, he gave a small nod. As far as we know, yes. A breath Juliet did not realize she was holding finally escaped. The feeling surprised her. She was angry, hurt, disappointed. Yet, hearing that Ethan was safe still mattered. The woman continued, "He is willing to cooperate." Sebastian thanked her quietly. A moment later, she left the room, allowing silence to return. Juliet looked down at the documents scattered across the table. Hours earlier, she thought Ethan had abandoned her. Now she knew he had tried to stop the wedding. She knew financial agreements had trapped him inside decisions he never should have faced. But one question remained. Why did he disappear instead of telling me everything? Sebastian sat back down across from her. Sunlight reflected softly across the polished table, because by the time he understood the full situation, he believed nobody would believe him. Juliet looked away. The answer hurt because she could understand it. Fear had shaped nearly every decision in this story. Fear of losing money, fear of losing reputation, fear of facing consequences. What happens now, she asked. Sebastian folded his hands. Now the facts become public. The statement felt enormous, irreversible. Sebastian did not answer immediately. He never rushed difficult truths. Including your father. Juliet stared out the window. 40 stories below. People moved through Manhattan unaware that her world was changing by the minute. She thought about childhood birthdays, piano recitals, family vacations, the father who sat in the front row cheering for her, the father who stayed awake helping her study, the father she loved. And then she thought about contracts, hidden agreements, deliberate omissions, a wedding used as leverage. Somehow both versions existed at the same time. Unfortunately for Juliet, investigators reviewing Ethan's testimony had already reached the final missing conclusion. The marriage itself had been positioned as a condition for restructuring debt connected to several failing investments. Richard Parker had not created the entire scheme alone, but he had knowingly allowed his daughter to remain uninformed while it moved forward. Back inside the conference room, Sebastian slid one final document toward her. This is Ethan's statement. Juliet hesitated before reading. The words were direct, honest, painfully human. Ethan admitted signing agreements he should have questioned. He admitted trying to delay the wedding. He admitted lacking the courage to tell Juliet everything once he realized how complicated the situation had become. Near the end of the statement, one sentence stood out. "I never stopped caring about her. I just stopped believing I could protect her." Juliet closed her eyes briefly, not because the sentence changed anything. It did not. But it finally explained something. The story she spent days imagining was never real. There had been no secret romance, no dramatic betrayal, only fear, weakness, bad decisions, and people protecting themselves at her expense. When she opened her eyes again, Sebastian was watching her carefully, not intrusively, not possessively, simply present, steady. For the first time since the wedding day, she felt something unexpected. Clarity. Then her phone vibrated. One new notification appeared across the screen, a live news alert. Federal investigators announce formal inquiry into financial misconduct involving multiple investment entities. Among the names listed in the article, one stood out immediately, Richard Parker, and in that instant, Juliet realized there would be no going back to the life she had known before. Healing rarely begins when the truth is discovered. Healing begins when the truth no longer controls your future. 3 weeks later, autumn sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Michael's Chapel, the same wooden pews, the same aisle lined with polished oak, yet everything felt different. Juliet sat alone near the front row, her hands resting quietly in her lap. The silence around her no longer felt empty, it felt peaceful. Outside, the trees had begun changing color. Golden leaves drifted across the church grounds whenever the wind passed through. Life had continued moving forward despite everything that had happened. The investigation had expanded exactly as Sebastian predicted. Financial records had been reviewed, agreements had been examined, testimonies had been collected. The facts eventually spoke for themselves. Richard Parker had cooperated with investigators and publicly acknowledged the decisions he made. The process had been painful, humiliating, necessary. Juliet had attended only one hearing. That was enough. She no longer needed every answer. Some consequences belonged to the people who created them. More importantly, she had finally stopped carrying responsibility for choices that were never hers. A soft creak echoed through the chapel as the main doors opened. Juliet looked over her shoulder. Sebastian Romano stepped inside. No security team, no assistants, no lawyers, just Sebastian. Sunlight followed him briefly before the doors closed again. He walked slowly down the aisle, the colored glass painted shifting patterns across his dark suit. When he reached her row, he stopped. "You came." A small smile touched Juliet's lips. "You asked." He sat beside her, neither spoke immediately. The quiet felt comfortable now, familiar. Somewhere above them an old ceiling fan hummed softly. Dust floated through beams of afternoon light. For several moments they simply sat together, looking forward, sharing the silence. "I have been thinking about that night," Juliet finally said. Sebastian knew exactly which night she meant. The night he found her crying alone inside this chapel. "So have I." Juliet studied the stained glass ahead. "There is still one thing I never understood." Sebastian nodded slightly. "The promise." She turned toward him. "Yes." For the first time all afternoon, his expression became serious, not guarded, honest, the kind of honesty that required effort. "When I saw you sitting here that night, I recognized something." Juliet waited. "My mother used to sit exactly like that." The answer surprised her. Sebastian looked toward the altar. His voice remained calm, but something deeper moved beneath it. Years ago, people made decisions for her. They treated her future like a transaction. They convinced her she had no choices. Juliet listened carefully. She had never heard him speak about his family, and nobody protected her. Sebastian shook his head. Nobody. The chapel fell quiet again. Sunlight shifted across the floor between them. Finally, Juliet understood. The promise had never been about control. It had never been a threat. It had never been ownership. It was something else entirely, something much simpler, something much harder. Protection without conditions, presence without demands. Sebastian looked directly at her. "That night, I promised myself that nobody'd for love, approval, or security again." Emotion tightened her throat unexpectedly, not because of the words themselves, because she knew he had already kept the promise through every document. Every opportunity to manipulate the situation. He had never asked for anything in return. "Why?" she whispered. A faint smile appeared. "Because someone should have done it for my mother." The answer lingered between them. Honest, uncomplicated, real. Juliet looked away before emotion could overwhelm her. Outside, a church bell rang somewhere in the distance, one clear note carried by the wind. Then Sebastian reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a small velvet box. Juliet's breath caught. The afternoon sunlight reflected softly across the polished wood of the pew. Sebastian looked down at the box for a moment before meeting her eyes again, and with a steadiness that carried no fear, no pressure, and no conditions, he quietly asked the question that would determine the rest of both their lives. The people who change our lives are not always the ones we plan to love. Sometimes they are simply the ones who stay. For a moment the world seemed to disappear. The chapel, the stained glass windows, the autumn sunlight, everything faded into the background as Juliet looked at the small velvet box resting in Sebastian's hand. Months earlier she had walked into this same building believing her future was ending. Now, she sat in the exact same place, facing a future. Expression remained steady, calm. There was no pressure in his eyes, no expectation, only honesty. "Juliet," he said quietly, "I am not asking because I rescued you. I am not asking because you owe me anything, and I am certainly not asking because I need an answer today." The sunlight shifted across the wooden floor between them. "Then why are you asking?" she whispered. A faint smile touched his face. "Because every version of my future that makes sense includes you in it." Emotion tightened her throat. Not because the words were dramatic, because they were sincere. Over the past several months she had learned the difference. Grand promises were easy. Consistency was rare. Sebastian had never demanded trust. He earned it one day at a time, one choice at a time, through difficult truths, through uncomfortable conversations, through moments when walking away would have been easier. Juliet looked down at the ring, then back at him. The answer had already been growing inside her for weeks. Yes, the word arrived softly, yet somehow it felt stronger than anything she had ever said. Relief and happiness crossed Sebastian's face at the same time. Not victory, not possession. Joy. Genuine joy. The church bell outside rang once more, as if the world itself had heard her answer. 6 months later, sunlight poured through St. Michael's Chapel once again. The same stained glass windows cast rivers of color across the pews. Friends filled the rows. Family members sat quietly. Others remained complicated. That was life. Not every wound disappeared completely, but people learned how to move forward. Richard Parker sat near the back, older, humbled, changed. The investigation had concluded months earlier. Consequences had followed, so had accountability. The relationship between father and daughter was still rebuilding itself one conversation at a time. It would never be exactly what it had been before. Yet for the first time in years it was honest. At the front of the chapel, Sebastian waited beside the altar. No business empire, no reputation, no power. None of those things mattered here. Only the man remained. The doors opened. Every head turned. Juliet stepped inside. Sunlight wrapped around her as she entered. Her dress was simple, elegant, nothing like the one she wore months ago. This time there was no uncertainty in her steps, no fear, no hidden agreements waiting behind the ceremony. She was here because she chose to be. Slowly she walked down the aisle. Sebastian's eyes never left her. The distance between them grew smaller with every step. When she finally reached the altar, neither spoke immediately. They simply looked at each other. Two people who had survived disappointment, uncertainty, and painful truths. Two people who had discovered that love was not something owed, it was something freely given. The ceremony itself felt almost effortless. Honest words, honest promises, honest choices. When it was over, applause filled the chapel, laughter followed. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass brighter than ever. Yet the most important moment arrived later. Long after the guests had left, long after the photographs were finished. Long after the celebrations faded into memory, Juliet returned to the same pew where everything began, the same seat where she once sat alone in a wedding dress, convinced nobody had chosen her. The afternoon light painted warm colors across the wood. This bash she was sat beside her. Their hands rested together between them. No secrets, no contracts, no fear, just peace. For a while neither spoke, they simply watched the sunlight move through the chapel. Finally, Juliet leaned her head gently against his shoulder. Outside, autumn leaves drifted across the church grounds. Silence settled around them like something sacred, and in the very place where she once believed she had lost everything, Juliet Parker realized she had finally found the one thing she had been searching for all along. Not rescue, not protection, not even love. She had found certainty that she was worthy of all three.